Good afternoon. I'm Amy Jordan, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Michigan Association of Planning. We're very pleased that you've joined us today for our lunch webinar on planning and zoning for solar energy systems. Um, our experts here will kick us off, starting with Madeline.
Wonderful. Hi, Amy, and thank you, Amy, for introducing us, and thank you, MAP, for having us here today, and for all of you for joining us. I'm gonna tag team this with my dear colleague, Mary Riley, to talk today about planning and zoning for solar energy systems and kind of focus on pathways for local communities and all of this. I'm gonna share my drive these slides if I can. Yes. A quick intro about me. I'm a clean energy land use specialist at the Center for Empowering Communities, which is a center at the University of Michigan Graham Sustainability Institute. Through the partnership with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, I lead the Renewable Energy Academy program, where I develop educational opportunities and provide individual technical assistance to mostly Michigan's rural governments on planning and zoning for large-scale solar, wind, and battery energy storage systems. My background's in planning too, local sustainability initiatives and engaged research, so it's a good mix. Enabled by EGLE funding, we have been collaborating with these partners that you see here for a number of years. Recently, the state of Michigan was awarded funding through the Federal Department of Energy's RSTEP program, which now enables us all to collaborate even more and provide even more technical assistance on large-scale renewables for Michigan's communities, which includes creating resources such as the resource of the Solar Guide, which we'll talk about more today. One of the key partners to U of M in all of this really is Michigan State University Extension, and I'm really excited to be providing today's webinar today with Mary Riley at MSUE, and so I'm going to have Mary introduce herself real quick.
Hi, everyone. Mary Riley with MSU Extension, and I enjoy working with Madeline and U of M as well. And I am based in Manistee on the west side of the state. I serve northern Michigan and statewide projects like this related to renewable energy. You might know me from citizen planner or zoning administrator. We do a lot of really good signature programs and basics for planning commission, ZBA, and zoning administrators as well. So kick it off, Madeline.
Awesome. More from Mary later. For the beginning, a quick just housekeeping. We have built in a lot of time for Q&A, so please feel free to drop questions as they come through to you in the chat, and then we'll answer them towards the end of our presentation. So feel free to pop them in there as you go and as they come up, and we'll make sure to answer them at the end. If you have technical issues, there is some information provided on the slide, but I would assume that you've made it here so far. That's great. All right, we want to cover a little bit about the basics of solar energy. Some of you might be very familiar with it already, and some of you might be newer to renewable energy or solar specifically. We'll cover just the basics, including components, types, and scales, and those kinds of things. Mary then will translate that into what that means from a land use consideration perspective. We'll kind of as a precursor to understanding the sample zoning that we're going to be talking about today. We'll also talk about zoning pathways in light of Michigan's renewable energy siting law, PA 233, which now creates different avenues for zoning for the really big projects. All of this is summarized in this new updated resource, which is this guidebook. Some of you may know that I believe it's a 2021 version of this guide that folks at MSU Extension and U of M have worked on together in the past. It's an explainer of solar energy and sample zoning language. So today we'll kind of tease all of the parts of that guide. You can access it on MSU Extension's webpage. And go from there. Part of that, and I just want to acknowledge all of the folks that have worked on this guide are listed here, all of the authors, two of which are Mary and I, but there's a big team behind all of this. We have more folks who reviewed this guide from industry, from local government, from planning professionals to make sure that this guide is kind of rooted in peer review. Why have we come up with a new updated guide? Well, a lot has changed, specifically new legislation. In 2023, in the fall of 2023, the Michigan legislature adopted a variety of renewable energy related laws. First and foremost, an increased renewable energy target to reach renewables, to reach 60% renewable by 2035. But it also, and that's relevant for accessory rooftop solar, increased the distributed energy generation cap to 10%, so practically allowing for more rooftop solar. It introduced PA 233 of 2023, which now creates the state siting process for big renewable energy projects, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. It created the PILT option for utility scale solar projects. So in lieu of standard depreciation tables, now there's a fixed payment in lieu of tax option for local governments to tap into. It codified kind of the exception of allowing solar on PA 116 lands through PA 230 of 2023. And lastly, which is not a 2023 bill, but a 2024 bill, is here on this list, PA 68 of 2024, which basically practically lifts HOA bans on solar panels or HOA restrictions. So a lot of new legislation really led to us picking up this guide again and making adjustments to make it make sense in the new legislative landscape. I want to spend just a couple of minutes on some of the basics, and some of this might be super familiar to you already. If so, this is just a refresher, but to some of you, this might be new. Over the course of the year, a solar panel in Michigan produces approximately 70% of the energy of that same solar parcel in Phoenix, Arizona. Because I often hear, is Michigan even sunny enough? Why are developers looking to Michigan for solar energy? And yes, while Arizona is more, is sunnier, so to speak, there's still significant solar potential in Michigan as well. And so I always like to point people to that comparison of 70% of what an Arizona panel can be produced in Michigan. And then if you look closer at the scale, this is also not a scale from 0 to 10, it's a 4 to 6. So yes, it's less sunny in Michigan, but it's still very much feasible to develop solar projects here. Another reason for, or a reason for why solar has become such a big topic in recent years really is as the main driver, the reduction of costs. This graph shows the unsubsidized cost of utility scale solar over the last couple of years since, I believe, 2009. And on the left side, you have the cost of megawatt hours of solar in dollars, and you can really see that dramatic decline in costs, particularly within the last 15 years. And then it kind of has phased out a little bit towards the end, but it's still a downward trend. There is an interesting bump in 2023, which is set to be due to supply chain challenges and inflation. But generally, this is the trend that solar has just become significantly cheaper in the last several years. This is a different version of looking at cost for solar, which I find helpful in understanding why there's so much attention on utility scale solar, which is the difference in price. And you really see that utility scale solar is one of the cheapest cost of energy generation compared to the first row, which kind of shows smaller scale commercial industrial business kind of applications of solar energy. The old versions of this graph used to also include a row on rooftop solar or residential solar, which is also significantly more expensive per megawatt hour than utility scale solar is. Again, this is the economies of scale that we're talking about here and kind of the soft costs associated with acquiring customers, cost of permitting and inspection and interconnection. And so that is why so much attention is on the utility scale. Small scale, so net metered solar is also on the rise. This graph shows customers enrolled in distributed generation programs with DTE and consumers who make up more than 90% of the statewide program capacity. This data is a little bit outdated. I was struggling to find updated information, but it really shows the increase of customers enrolled in these programs, of which the majority of this is solar. And so behind the meter residential business office space solar systems, they add up together to more than 175 megawatts, which is a little bit less than Michigan's currently largest solar farm with 239 megawatts, which is the Assembly Solar Project in Shiawassee County, just for scale. I always like to show these maps of existing utility scale renewable energy projects, or specifically solar. I have this map which shows existing projects, and then I have another map which shows those projects that are in the pipeline. And you don't need to worry too much about the actual numbers of megawatts. You see there is quite some wind in the thumb, and then kind of the heart of the mitten. Solar is kind of scattered all across the lower peninsula, the lower half of the lower peninsula. And we have a little bit of battery energy storage systems which I'll show you a picture later, but minimal. When we now look in what's in the pipeline, these are projects that are in the MISO queue. So MISO is the regional grid operator. Any developer of a project first has to apply to MISO, which is a multiple year process, to see, is there space on the grid to connect a new project into? What would the price of that be? And so not all of these projects will get built, but it's a good indication of where are developers looking for projects and which kind of technologies are they looking at. And again, without getting too distracted by the actual numbers, I just want to point your attention to the fact of how much solar is in the pipeline next to lots of battery energy storage. So solar and storage are really kind of the focal points of what developers are currently looking at. While we're talking about storage, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Planning and Zoning Guidebook for Energy Storage Systems that we've come out with late last year. Yes. A quick note on energy storage, just because some of the solar projects that we see in the state come with batteries, but actually more so batteries come as a standalone project. And so I've put some pictures on here just for you to get a sense for how these things look like and kind of the footprint of those projects. So the left two are the two operating battery storage projects in Michigan that we have now, but there are a lot larger ones immediately in the pipeline. I think the Tibbetts battery storage in Coldwater Township is currently being commissioned. So it's going to be one of the first big over 50 megawatt battery storage projects in Michigan. If you'd like to learn more about battery storage, let me know and you can check out this guide. Back to solar. Why is there so much activity? There is an increasing demand from consumers, cities, and corporations on the one hand, but also it's really those cost reductions that have made solar a viable development opportunity across the state. And even before we had renewed renewable energy targets, the largest utilities in Michigan were calling for a 4 times increase in renewables overall, with those megawatt numbers provided down here at the bottom in the big utilities integrated resource plans, where they're sketching out what's the cheapest way of providing energy in the years to come. And renewables were a big part of that too, even before we increased our renewable energy targets. All right, while we're talking about solar basics, I want to briefly show just a couple of pictures and go over a couple of key terms as we're thinking about solar. Generally, the guide that I've mentioned at the beginning provides a definition for solar energy systems, which really is a photovoltaic system for generating electricity, including all above and below ground equipment or components required for the system to operate properly and to be secure to roof, surface, structure, or on the ground. So here's a couple of pictures of just components. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but just to introduce some language here. A lot of the solar panels that are ground mounted in Michigan today are bifacial panels, meaning that they can also any sunlight that reflects off of the ground can also be captured. Panels sit on a racking and tracking system. Commonly, these nowadays or modern utility scale projects have rotating panels that track the sun, always face the sun. Here's some additional equipment in forms of a transformer and an inverter that takes all of the energy and then steps up the voltage to then feed it into the transmission infrastructure. And so just a couple of pictures for insights on how these things look like. Here's a couple of types, again, not an exhaustive list of solar. Rooftop solar is, I think, what most people are familiar with. Then there's some other accessory applications of solar. And then we have the big category of ground-mounted solar that really spans from just a couple of panels to the really, really big scale. Now Mary will dive into these types and scales a little bit more precisely and talk a little bit more about how that translates to land use. And I'll stop sharing my screen and Mary takes over.
All right, and if we could launch our first poll, that would be great.
Absolutely. Let's do
All
that.
right.
Poll number 1. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Hopefully. Yes, thank you.
So we're wondering if you're in your community or communities you work in, if you have adopted regulation for accessory solar rooftop or ground mounted systems. Yes, no, the mix? I'm not sure. So what do we have? Oh, you're muted, Amy.
Muted, sorry. 17 folks have answered so far. We've got 25 on the call. Let's see. Anybody else want to weigh in? All right. Going. I'm going to end the poll, share results. Everybody see those?
So it looks like it's a mix. Some about a third have, some have not, and some are not sure. All right, now we know what we're working with
All right.
for those accessory systems. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about some land use considerations. And what I mean by that is we often do zoning before planning. We know we're supposed to do planning first and then zoning. So let's talk about what does planning look like in terms of large scale solar. And the guide, which was mailed to a lot of folks recently, talks about all scales of solar across all the landscapes. So from accessory mounted roof systems, like you see on this top row of this diagram, from left to right, it goes from natural to more urban settings. So those, we're hoping that in communities that they are purposefully saying yes to this policy of allowing roof mounted or ground mounted systems that are in multiple different contexts, from a very small solar panel on a light post to, you know, parking garages and all sorts of things. And on the left side is accessory roof mounted, ground mounted, and then from principal use systems, meaning that that solar system is really the principal use on the property. So the guide addresses all of these scales. So minimally, depending on where you live or what your context is, we hope that you will at least start to think about accessory solar in your zoning ordinance. And when considering planning and land use, let's talk about this conversion of megawatts to acres, because planners, we really think more in acres. The industry And MPSC and their, the new statute, they use megawatts. So 1 megawatt takes about 5 to 10 acres, or occupies about 5 to 10 acres. And you'll see that we use that simple math all throughout. So for 100 megawatts, it's about 500 to 1,000 acres. And this can be a little eye-opening to some communities as they're planning, because in some parts of Michigan, you could have 1,000 or 2,000 acres under single ownership. In other communities, 100 acres might be a really large parcel. So thinking in planning for renewable energy, we're thinking about addressing scale and that local context. So, what might we be planning for in terms of solar scale? And given our audience today, that most of you are probably planners, this is pretty familiar territory, but the key point is that communities should be talking about renewable energy in their master plans and considering, again, that local context and scale. So 2 quick key questions to think about when planning for solar is, where does this renewable energy fit with the long-term plan? And maybe there's conversations about which technology. So solar or battery energy storage, wind, at different scales, and where might they go? And all zoning has to be based on a plan. So renewable energy really should be a component of a local plan, mentioned in the plan, and the goal or objective of the plan, somewhere. So if a community can't delay amending their zoning ordinance to first amend their plan, we encourage you to work closely with a planner or attorney and reviewing your existing plan to maybe find elements that do support or contradict solar energy, a solar energy zoning amendment. So maybe that's vision statement, your goals, land use classifications, or the purpose of those different land uses, and so forth. And minimally, it's also very helpful to have a statement affirming a preferred scope or location for solar in a zoning plan, which is part of the master plan. That can go a long ways in informing a future zoning amendment. And Act 233 is Madeline mentioned, that does not specifically talk about planning or relying on a local plan. However, the Michigan Public Service Commission does aim to have developers submit local plans as part of the review. And so to think through compatibility of solar with other typical goals that might be in a master plan, we offer this table here as a sample. Again, it's just a sample. This is our opinion, so it's not, we don't mean for you to transfer this into your plans, but starting with that mixed use on the top, for example, we suggest that accessory and small principal use are compatible with mixed use types of development, but medium or large principal uses that are those hundreds of acres are maybe not compatible. Maybe housing is a better option because you have roads and water and sewer and broadband and all of those things in that area. And then if you go down the list, we separate out farmland preservation goals versus farm viability goals. So farm preservation means that property is going to stay in farming, where a large scale solar project might, is not compatible with that. But farm viability, yeah, if a farmer wanted to place a portion of their land in a solar lease and that help them to invest in other parts of their farming operation, yeah, that would help. So again, this is just a sample of how you could do this in your community to see where solar and at certain scales fits or doesn't fit, is or is not compatible. And in thinking about resource analysis for renewables, we offer this example. This is from the EGLE Solar Suitability Tool for Planning and Zoning, and we will share this link in a follow-up program. But EGLE has done some mapping work where on this map in the blue areas, those are land that are supporting of solar. The red lines are transmission lines. And so these are typically relatively open, flat lands, and they have access to the grid or transmission. The lighter colors, the peach, the yellow, are factors that detract from solar development. Wetlands, protected lands, maybe federal lands, sensitive habitat, heavily wooded vegetation, steep slopes, those kinds of things would detract from solar. And so it might be beneficial to your community. There's other tools out there as well, but getting a better understanding of solar suitability in your community and how that might inform some goals analysis. And Madeline mentioned PA 116, which was amended. PA 116 is shorthand for the Farmland and Open Space Preservation Program. It's administered by MDARD, and the program provides tax benefits to enrolled landowners. There's about 3 million acres of cropland enrolled in the program. And what the act did was it said that solar can be installed on land enrolled in PA 116 when certain conditions are met. So one is the field tile is maintained to preserve drainage. There has to be a cover crop. They specify a pollinator habitat in the law, and then surety bond has to be put in place to ensure the land can be returned to farming. And so we addressed this in the guide. It was a change along the way. And so if you're interested in that, that's on page 13 in the guide. FYI, there's no centralized mapping of what land is or is not in PA 116. It is publicly available information at your Register of Deeds office, but you'd have to look on a parcel by parcel basis. So plans can also contain policies and should contain policies that are supportive of agrivoltaics and ecovoltaics as a vegetative management strategy under solar panels. And what is agrivoltaics? Well, it pairs solar with crop production. And there's a lot of research going on with this right now. Crops are different. How you harvest the crop is different with different machinery and so forth. But we do know broccoli, kale, some of these kind of cold crops can be grown under solar panels, as well as sheep can be grazed under panels. We have 2 sheep grazing projects in Michigan right now. One is in Calhoun and one's in Wexford County. And ecovoltaics is those pollinator habitats or conservation cover, so wildflowers, maybe prairie grasses that really help to improve the health of the soil. And there's projects like this in Michigan as well. Sturgis is one, which is the Electric City Solar Project. So again, it's important to establish that your community values these kinds of strategies, and that should be put in your plan. Otherwise, turf or gravel or some other kind of industry default might be what is seen or installed. So planning for solar on marginal lands can also be done, and there's a lot of public support around this, putting solar on brownfields, parking lots, abandoned industrial sites, landfills, and so forth. And the plan should set policy goals to streamline that kind of development or incentivize it if that is a priority for the community. And solar installation at this scale is more complex. It's more costly. Think of the engineering that might be involved with a contaminated site. And so communities need to make it super easy and even incentivize this kind of development. In Michigan, there is a new pilot program just launched to help lower costs of developing on brownfields. So we'll look forward to that in the future. This picture is from Coldwater, where you'll see that's a brownfield. And so the solar panels are ballasted there so they don't have to interfere with the ground cover. And how community considers timelines for renewable energy is really interesting, in that planners have to consider it as sort of a temporary use in terms of, you just saw the PA 116, it said when these panels are removed, you're going to return it to a farmable condition, right? But we also have to consider that a solar project could be repowered at the end, of its first go, maybe new racking and new arrays, and the life of that project is extended another, 30 or 40 years. And so We don't often think of housing or building in this light, but we do with renewables and with solar in particular. And so the guide addresses this notion of decommissioning or potentially repowering the site to extend the life of that project. So a few things to think about in terms of the planning context. And now Madeline is going to kick off zoning pathways.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary. So we now covered kind of the basics. We covered the key land use considerations from a planner point of view. And before we can now translate that into zoning language, we ought to kind of shift gears a little bit and better understand Michigan's new siting regime that changes how we can plan and zone for these large projects, which is kind of a prerequisite for understanding how to think about this for in zoning for the largest of projects. Okay, so we now have PA Public Act 233 of 2023, which was adopted in the fall of 2023 and became effective in November 2024. So just more than a half a year ago now at this point. PA 233 creates an option for a developer of a large-scale solar, wind, or energy storage project to ask the Michigan Public Service Commission, or MPSC, to permit a renewable energy project unless a local government has a zoning ordinance that qualifies as a compatible renewable energy ordinance, a CREO. There are a couple of other triggers, but this is kind of the gist of it. This only applies to really the largest of projects, so 50 megawatts of nameplate capacity for solar projects, or if we use Mary's kind of a rule of thumb calculator, it's those projects that are like 500 acres and larger, approximately. So it's the really, really big ones. Anything below is still subject to regular zoning, but now for those largest of projects, there is the option for a developer, basically a backstop option, that if permitting through the local level does not advance, that then the developer can take it to the MPSC for state permitting. I want to just highlight or shout out two important notes that are kind of at the bottom of this. A developer is not required to go to the MPSC, and they may stay local even if the ordinance is not a CREO. I'll talk about this more in just a second. The second really big note is that any project that reaches a permitting stage has a voluntary landowner host. So either a landowner that is selling or they're leasing their land. There is no eminent domain. I get that question all the time. There's a state siting process, but there's no eminent domain. There's a third note at the very, very bottom. There are some exceptions for cities and villages in this law. It's a bit complicated, but if you follow me, it's if a city or village is exempt from PA 233, if on the one hand, the energy facility is located entirely within a city or village, and one of three other requirements, either if the city or village is the owner of the participating property, or the city or village is a developer of the facility, or the city or village owns an electric utility that will take service from the energy facility. So there are these exceptions for city and villages, exclusive to cities and villages. Okay, so what does that mean for local governments? In the past year and a half, we've really been trying to condense this new legislation into actionable options for local governments. And so on the one hand, we have these CREOs, the Compatible Renewable Energy Ordinance, which is a really, it's a guardrailed zoning ordinance constrained by PA 233, specifically section 2268, which spells out how a sound standard or a setback cannot be more restrictive than what is spelled out in the law. I do want to add an asterisk here that there currently is an ongoing lawsuit on some of the questions on what can be in a CREO for it to be considered a CREO, who is a local unit of or an affected local unit. There's a couple of other things, but from our most conservative non-attorney perspective, a local ordinance is really just constrained by those section 2268 standards. So that's the one pathway that's being introduced through this law. The second pathway created through this law is the state level certification process, the MPSC process. which has those same PA 233 section 2268 requirements on setbacks and sound and those kinds of things. But there are 21 additional minimum conditions of approval and evaluation criteria that the commission has to consider when deciding on whether to approve or to deny a project. One of these evaluation criteria is the impact on farmland. It will be interesting as we are observing now the first kind of applications trickling into to the MPSC on how the MPSC will actually decide on these evaluation criteria. So far, there has been one application filed to the Michigan Public Service Commission, which was recently deemed incomplete. So there's still a lot of observing happening on how it's actually going to play out and some of these softer, in quotation marks, criteria. Kind of in a nutshell, it's as permissive standards as what the CREO provides, but there is a strong focus in the MPSC process on due diligence and enforcement, because that's taken care of by the state rather than the local unit of government. Then there are these other two, the orange and the red pathways, which aren't formally introduced in the law, but they exist. These are local zoning ordinances that don't meet the CREO requirements, so they are incompatible. And that means that at any point, a developer could argue that a local government does not have a CREO, and therefore the developer can take the project application to the state at any point. There is a bit of an interesting nuance here in this bucket of incompatible ordinances, which is some of them are workable ordinances and some of them are too restrictive. What really, at the end of the day, whether something is workable or not is entirely decided upon the particular developer in that particular project, because they have now the opportunity to take it to the state for permitting. But the idea of a workable zoning ordinance is that it's a local zoning ordinance, stricter than a CREO, but inherently it does make space for renewables. And it's highly context dependent, so there's no two ordinances that are the same. On the other hand, an unworkable ordinance would be a local zoning ordinance deemed unworkable by the developer and will most likely or very likely shift the application for a project to the Michigan Public Service Commission. So why do these workable ordinances work? You might think. Well, we are making this distinction of workable ordinances because PA 233 really is considered as a backstop and not the first choice. MPSC permitting is more expensive. It requires more studies. It requires a very sophisticated contested case process with attorneys who are experienced with these processes. It is time intensive. The MPSC has up to a year to decide on a case, which is usually longer than what a local government might take. And it's also, developers also acknowledge that it might be unpopular depending on the community that they're working in. And so in a nutshell, a CREO really is a top preference from a developer point of view because it's cheap, it's quick, it's pretty standardized as to which standards would apply to a project. But then the workable is kind of the next best. It's the in-between space where if you think about a CREO, it's kind of a bare bones zoning ordinance as the floor, and the MPSC process, perhaps what a developer might prefer to avoid, it's the in-between space that really makes up this very wobbly concept of a workable zoning ordinance. And so the MPSC is presumably only being pursued by a developer when a local zoning ordinance is unworkable. I have the word caveat here on the slide because at the end of the day, there might be developer, or it's not a guarantee. The law exists to provide a backstop. And so, there are developers, and we see that now as applications are trickling into the state that are making use of that process. I want to have a quick shout out here to the Renewables Ready Communities Award, because it is part of this whole equation of understanding why a developer might prefer a local pathway rather than the MPSC pathway. The Renewables Ready Communities Award is a grant from the State Energy Office in EGLE that provides for host communities and permitting communities up to $5,000 per megawatt as a one-time payment and grant. If the process is local. If the project application goes through the state, then a developer has to pay, so it's prescribed in PH 33, a $2,000 per megawatt host community agreement, which then the developer pays. So if the project stays local, the developer does not have to pay that, but instead the local government gets that funding from the state government. And so if you would like to learn more about the Renewables Ready Communities Award, there are $30 million allocated. We're almost full, but we're currently waiting on allocation through the state budget process to increase that amount available through the RRCA. All right, if we'll take it to the next slide, I want to give you just a very quick overview of what's even in a CREO. What is this section 2268 all about? And so here you see for solar energy, wind energy, and energy storage, kind of those things that are spelled out in 2268. So it says, or it provides specific setbacks with numbers and measuring locations, sound, height, fencing, lighting, which is, again, in times of lawsuits, the most conservative interpretation of the CREO. But there is a lot more that we usually would see in a local zoning ordinance that's not in the CREO. If we click on the next slide, we see kind of the added on part at the bottom is what the MPSC project adds. So it's those same 2268 standards, but then there are conditions on screening, on sound study and compliance that we don't find in the CREO, but that we do find in the MPSC process. So it's really a strong focus on complaint resolution, due diligence, and enforcement. If we click on the next slide, or the next couple of slides, I want to quickly just shout out the pros and the cons of each of the pathways, because in our communications with local governments, we're not suggesting any one pathway is the best way to go for all communities, but rather considering kind of the why and the why nots. So a community might want to pass a CREO if they're interested in hosting renewable energy and actually attracting renewable energy developers. This pathway will guarantee that the permitting process stays local. It's the only way to guarantee for it to stay local. With a caveat, though, that for intermunicipal projects, so if another municipality does not have a CREO, but the project spans township boundaries, for example, and the developer can't get the other parts of the project permitted locally, then the entire project application gets taken to the state. The CREO pathway also provides the lowest, or is the lowest amount of municipal workload. There's sample zoning ordinances or sample CREOs. We have one, the Michigan Townships Association has put one together. So it's really a kind of copy-paste type of situation. Because of how a CREO process would be a local permitting process, local governments would be eligible for the Renewables Ready Communities Award. So it's $5,000 per megawatt one-time payment from EGLE. Or a community might want to defer to the state permitting process if they're comfortable with the project going through the state process after researching the proposal and kind of watching now how the MPSC is holding those criteria and evaluation standards against applications as they're rolling in. It saves local governments the municipal workload of actually developing an ordinance or to kind of engage in the conversations with the developer and enforcement and so on. Because of how this is a state process, local governments are not eligible for the RRCA, but instead will receive the host community agreement that the developer has to pay to them, as well as intervenor funding to be able to hire attorneys to represent the local government. There's also an argument of passing accountability to the state, which is a sentiment that I've definitely heard in conversation with communities before. So let's just have the state figure this out. Why a local government might want to pass a workable ordinance is because it it incorporates a little bit more zoning preferences than a CREO can, though it still makes room for renewables. Or at the end of the day, it would still make room for renewables with a little bit more local preference involved than a CREO. If conversations are flexible and in good faith, it's unlikely for a developer to actually go to the MPSC because of how I mentioned before, it's faster, it's usually less costly for the developer and more popular. because of how it's local, it would be, or local governments would be eligible for the RRCA for the EGLE grant. An unworkable ordinance, and why local governments might want to peruse an unworkable ordinance, is to really express all of the community benefits, even though a developer might find them unworkable, aka undevelopable. It receives all of the MPSC path whys and why nots, because likely, again, it would probably, a project application would likely shift to the MPSC. Why? Let's get into the why not. So the downsides of each of these pathways. A CREO, you can't add any more preferences. It's really strict on what can be in a CREO and what can't be. And denying a project that's compatible with the law would then also kick the project application to the state. There are penalties for claiming that you have a CREO when you don't, which, for example, include the losing access to those intervenor funds if the project then goes to the state. And it depends a little bit on what the neighbors do. If the neighbors are having an unworkable ordinance or not permitting the project locally, then the whole application goes to the state anyways. With the MPSC pathways, obviously a local government can't add preferences or local preferences. And though there are suggestions that the MPC is going to impose stronger conditions and evaluation criteria, we haven't really seen precedent for this yet and how they're actually going to enforce that bar that they set. A local government is not eligible for the Renewables Ready Communities Award if it goes through the MPSC, and at the end of the day, this is not a local process. Why you might not want to peruse a workable or pursue a workable ordinance is that really is the pathway that comes with the highest workload. It really requires a well-informed and balanced ordinance. It requires an openness to negotiate, which is a word planners don't like, right? But to negotiate with the developer on what are the items in a zoning ordinance that might be sticky to that respective developer. And is there a willingness to amend the ordinance to make it work? Really takes dependence, so it's difficult to kind of take like template language and just apply it across different communities. And at any point, you have the risk of still being called unworkable or incompatible or not a CREO. And so the developer may take a community to the state at any point. The downside with an unworkable ordinance is the very, very high risk of losing the local process and shifting it to the MPSCs. And it may actually turn away developers that are interested in working it out at the local level. How to go for any of these pathways. For CREO, I think it's pretty straightforward. Passing a zoning ordinance that's no more restrictive than the standards in the law. Again, there's sample template language available. How to either initiate or be taken to the MPSCs. You can just not have an zoning ordinance updated on the books. You can inform a developer that you want them to go to the state, or you just silence and wait it out. Either way, there are staff at the MPSC who are available to answer any questions. We've come up with some resources for local governments navigating that process, like a checklist of what to consider and when can you engage. If communities want to adopt a workable zoning ordinance, we recommend kind of looking at what's in the MPSC process, what has worked, what are things in the MPSC process that a local government finds relevant to, and then what are things that are required in the state process, but that a local government might live without with. And really kind of trimming a little bit based on local preferences. It's also helpful to look at what has worked before, which is going to be my next slide in just a second. But importantly, it's when working out or when interested in a workable pathway to not claim a CREO because of those penalties that I mentioned earlier. If a local government wants to peruse or pursue an unworkable ordinance, it could be keeping the restrictive ordinance that's on the books or not adopting one. But again, important is to not claim that one has a CREO if there's any questions on whether it might be a CREO or not. Guidance on what's worked before. we have pulled together data that you can access publicly, where we looked at all of those projects that are currently operational in Michigan and looked at what was the zoning language in each of these. What were the setbacks? What were the noise standards? And pulled them all together. And it's really interesting to see that none of the ordinances we came across were CREOs, but also all of these ordinances had at least some shape or some flavor of a CREO, where either the setback was conform with P233 or another standard. And so it just gives a little bit of a starting point as to how have local governments permitted projects in the past. Granted, now with the different siting legislation, all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt, but I still think it's an interesting resource to check out. The simplified version of this table actually made it into the guidebook as well, where we take the most common zoning items for solar and compare them across the CREO, across the MPSC, and in that workable data set to kind of give a range for how have setbacks looked in the past and how does that compare to the law, to kind of help planners and local governments as they are thinking about writing zoning ordinances, consider what might be the right pathway for this community that I'm working with, or my community, and what does that mean with regards to how I write my zoning ordinance. And so that was intense. We've got lots of resources more on this, but I want to make sure we have some time also for Mary to take us kind of into sample zoning language, actual tangible zoning language. Before we do that, we have one more poll, which I would ask Amy to start. Okay, the question should appear on your screen now, and it says, which zoning pathway or pathways have communities or the communities you work with chosen for large principal use solar projects? You might choose CREO, workable, MPSC, unworkable, no decision yet.
You should be able to select all that apply, but of course Zoom changed all of its settings, and so I was.
Let's try and see what happens.
One doesn't like to say winging it, but I was winging it because it was all different. All right, I've got 16 out of 16 answering. Other shy people out there? We had 17 last time. There we go, 7.
We want to make sure everyone's still paying attention. We know this is technical stuff. So.
Is definitely. All right, 17. Do I have 18? Anybody? Anybody? Anybody?
Let's
All
see.
right. I'm gonna end the poll. Okay, so I will share the results.
All right. 65% of communities or communities you're working with are going for a workable ordinance, which is by far the most popular one. There's a couple of CREOs in here, a couple of state processes, no one going for unworkable, and then there's a third of respondents have not yet made a decision, or communities have not yet made a decision. So for those, I would say we have some resources slides at the end where we talk more about the different pathways and kind of how they might work for certain communities better than for others. So maybe those aid in coming up with a decision. And for those that have already decided for CREO, WIO, or MPSC, we do have resources available too. Just a quick shout out. But that's really helpful in kind of understanding how now Mary continues talking about zoning. So thanks for entertaining the poll.
All right. Thank you. So this next portion, we're going to dive a little bit more into the zoning and the sample zoning and some of the content of the guide. And so I'll hold mine up here. Maybe you got that in the mail. I hope you did. If you didn't, there's it's freely downloadable again through MSU or U of M, their websites. So the updated guide addresses those new issues created by legislation, the pathways that Madeline just talked about, dual siting. So what if a solar project wants to add battery energy storage, or an existing wind project wants to add a solar component, or that kind of thing? So we address that issue. Stormwater and drainage is something we have learned about kind of collectively in Michigan. What happens when drain tiles are broken or when properties are regraded in combination with drainage, drain tiles breaking. So we do require a stormwater, assessment now in this guide. So it's a little more detailed than last time. And we've kept all that residential scale. And we utilize some of the definitions and language found in the statute of Act 233 as well, where it fits. And again, we address all scales in the guide, so those smaller on-site systems to the larger, special land use type of, decision making. And throughout the guide and the sample zoning, you will see the fill in the blank options. And that means ultimately this is a local decision. Whatever those setbacks are, measurements, especially if you're working on a workable ordinance, that's reliant on your local context. We additionally have a number of blue commentary boxes. So these are those deeper dives that maybe give a rationale for some of the things that you'll find in the sample zoning. And typically those were, the authors, we would be going down a rabbit hole and we'd say, oh, let's put this in a commentary. So at least kind of our thoughts or what we were thinking at that time. So this particular box, for example, is about height of ground mounted panels. So we talk about carports or hosting different agricultural crops underneath panels, and then the panels at full tilt, right? And all those things that might feed into a height maximum. The definitions, I was excited about this because I'm a planning nerd, and definitions can be really difficult to construct. We debated every word so that you might not have to. And we did the hair splitting so you don't have to. So thinking about height, accessory use, what is collectively a solar energy system, what's in it, and those differentiations between principal use, small, medium, and large that I'll talk about. So please take a look at those definitions. And we're kind of starting small here, small and basic. We're going to get more complicated. So the general provisions, we suggest that these accessory roof-mounted, wall-mounted, or ground-mounted systems be in your general provisions, and we provide sample language for that. And then building integrated systems, that would be where you have solar, say, in a window, like a film that generates solar electricity, or roof shingles that are solar panels. They're kind of unusual in Michigan, but that sort of thing would not require a permit, so we give exemption for that. And additionally, with the ground-mounted accessory systems, thinking about a couple different things. One is drawing a relationship to the size of how many panels you can have as it relates to the main building. So we draw kind of a relationship there. And then additionally thinking about visibility in the residential areas. So we suggest that, of course, they're in the side or the rear yard, but there may be times where there's a lack of solar access. Maybe there's septic interference. Waterfront lot, there could be some exceptions there that might put those panels in the front yard. And so trying to avoid a variance, maybe administrative approval for those kinds of situations that are uniquely associated with the physical elements of that property. And the document suggests permitting options and thresholds for this range from small to large systems. And so on this table here, you'll see a number of kind of sample zoning districts like commercial, low density, mixed use, industrial, et cetera. And then on the left, starting with those accessory roof and ground mounted systems, both we are suggesting those should be a permitted use. That's what that P stands for. And so moving on, the large systems that Madeline just talked about, we'll talk about that more explicitly on page 21 in the guide. Because that's going to be driven by the choices that you make for workable ordinance, a CREO, or the state siting option. And then those smaller scales, so up to 5 megawatts, which could be, 25 to 50 acres-ish. What is small, you'll see a lot more site plan review there. So we're suggesting that that is a scale. It's a locally determined scale. It doesn't have to be 5 megawatts. You can decide what that is. But it's a scale that the community is more comfortable with administrative or site plan review for that procedure, with maybe special land use in a few districts. And then those medium systems would be more commonly a special land use request. You'll see a few X's there too. That means that maybe a principal use system of that size is not appropriate for those districts. We're not suggesting that they are appropriate everywhere. And so that's where that planning comes in that I talked about earlier. Sometimes we get asked, do we have to use megawatts in local regulation to define scale? Is it required? And we use megawatts in the guide because it's an industry standard, and now the Michigan statute is tied to that megawatt threshold for the renewables. And 2 megawatts is also considered kind of utility scale for industry. And then that leads them to a different interconnection process on the grid. So a community could use acreage. However, those project footprints vary, right? Depending on setbacks and how many parcels are included in the project, the overall project design. So if you're going to use acreage, you've got to be really specific on how acreage is counted toward the project. For example, does it include the area in the setbacks? Does it include landscape? Does it include, does it just include the arrays? So you'd want to work really closely with an attorney on that. But caution for those large principal use systems, best probably to stick with that 50 megawatt threshold rather than any kind of acreage there, simply because that is that key threshold that leads to those different zoning pathways. So after addressing those small, medium accessory uses, it's important to determine that pathway. So that's kind of a key jumping off point in the guide. So are we going to do a workable pathway, which many of you suggested that you are going to do that, a CREO or the MPSC. And so knowing that pathway is going to help you to navigate sort of the remainder of the lift for your sample zoning, especially for those large systems over the 50 megawatts. And these next slides, I'm going to go kind of quick. They're really meant to familiarize with you with what's in the guide. And I'm going to go pretty quickly. So don't worry about reading everything. The goal is to really give you a sense for what's in the guide. And you can ask questions later. We can circle back. For example, we'll just start here with setbacks, and notice that the setback is measured from the nearest edge of the perimeter fencing or closest point of the solar array if there is no fence. So those kinds of things, where do we measure setbacks to and from? And so we suggest for small systems, follow the setbacks for principal structures in that district. Medium, we offer some suggested language again, and then the large, it's referring to, if it's a CREO, there's probably a sample CREO that you're going to be using. MTA, U of M has a sample CREO, maybe your attorney has a sample CREO. It won't be that complicated because it's already laid out in statute what your setbacks are going to be. And then the workable suggestion is, again, what Madeline, she showed those tables from U of M that you can go in and look at different communities to sort out what might be an appropriate setback. Fencing is a little trickier than one might suspect for solar, and there's 2 key points here. And one is, don't get hung up on, maximum height. Notice we use minimum height here. And this is partially because the DNR recommends 8-foot fences to keep deer out of solar developments. A lot of communities have a 6-foot height maximum, but if you might need to get to 8 foot if keeping deer out is important. Additionally, you might want to have ban barbed wire. You could ban barbed wire in a workable ordinance. but that might put that fence up to a 7-foot fence to meet the National Electric Code rather than 6 foot with barbed wire. So a few things to think about there with fencing. And then height, additionally, we suggest 25 feet is very generous, but that again has to do with what kind of agricultural uses might be under those panels, and also accommodating the panels at full tilt. Sound is again here from small, medium, large. Sound is very technical and might require a little more attention, but thinking about where is the sound measured from? Is it a property line? Is it a dwelling? Is it near a dwelling, but not at the wall of the dwelling like the state statute? And then obviously selecting a decibel level. And additionally, you know, if you're a Creo, it's again, for the large, you're going to have the most discretion in terms of that workable ordinance. And screening is an element that could be addressed for small, medium, and in workable ordinances, but not a Creo. So the guide clarifies that landscaping would not be subject to setbacks. It's placed outside of the perimeter fencing, and we suggest flexibility here for screening with options to reduce or waive screening. You know, what if a part of the project was forested, you know, outside? You wouldn't need any screening there. Sometimes it serves no purpose. And so the commentary below addresses this intent to return property to farming. And so if berming is required or really a substantial landscaping feature, that could impact the ability of that property to be returned to farming. So you want to watch out for kind of excessive screening or berming if that is the intent. And we talked a lot about plans earlier, maybe being supportive of ecovoltaics and agrivoltaics. And so the sample zoning requires ground cover for medium and large projects. And under a workable ordinance, a community could specify ecovoltaics like pollinator plantings or agrivoltaics. Just know that agrivoltaics, especially too, like you need to start planning early for that, and the farmer has to want it, and there's a lot of things that has to come into play. Additionally, remember that land enrolled in PA 116 has those specific pollinator requirements, so make sure your regulation doesn't conflict with that. And we exempt brownfield parking lots, et cetera, from this kind of ground cover requirement because it doesn't always make sense to disturb the ground. And then there's sample language for decommissioning. Decommissioning is one of the most significant concerns that we hear about. How do we know for sure, you know, that these are going to be removed at the end of their life? And so we do provide that sample language. And remember, PA 116, there is additional financial surety guarantee for removal of the project. And so maybe a community could deduct that portion from their surety or try to work together on that. So it's not sort of a double charge on decommissioning. We recommend that decommissioning plans are updated every 5 years, or if there's a change of ownership, kind of to account for inflation and removal costs, et cetera. So that language might be of interest, addressing those community concerns you might be hearing about. So, as not to bore you completely, the guide addresses a lot of things. And so we've bulleted, you know, some bullet points here for some of these additional things that would be common elements in a solar ordinance. And the guide also makes distinction on what constitutes repair, such as replacing a broken panel for maintenance, or multiple panels for maintenance, versus replacing all the panels and essentially kind of repowering the system and extending the life of the project. And so we do sort of have that conversation in there, bridging this idea of what is temporary, what's permanent. So that might be of interest for you. And finally, The guide, this new guide contains the application requirements. And so that includes the site plan requirements, the required studies and documentation, such as a sound study or decommissioning plan, a stormwater management assessment. So that sample language is in there toward the end of the document. And so it's ready, it's more easily usable than our last guide. And we strongly encourage zoning administrators and planners working on these projects to create a checklist because they are so complex. And a checklist would be specific to whatever ordinance it is that you adopt, but they really are essential. And finally, we do cover escrow in this project on page 38 because it's unlikely that a planner or zoning administrator, your typical staff, can handle this alone. So it's very, very common to hire attorneys and planning consultants both to offset some of the labor that's involved with these. Because the zoning administrator or planner is probably going to be in a heavy coordinating role. They might not really have time to get into some of those specifics. So having an escrow is extremely important for these projects. All right, we're going to round it out with time for questions. So you've got lots of resources to choose from. Madeline kind of went over many of the different resources that U of M, that Graham has there. So I strongly encourage you to go to that website, particularly to look at those workable ordinances and other things. I forgot to mention, they have a checklist also for communities that maybe intentionally want the MPSC process. How should they still navigate that? Or maybe unintentionally were forced into the MPSC process. There's a separate checklist for that. So that might be of interest to you. And additional resources, obviously, from all of the partners, MTA, MPSC, and so forth, in the RSTEP program and elsewhere in the state. And then some additional resources for wind and solar mapping. MISO is that regional connection grid that Madeline showed the pictures of, but you can literally go and see the queue, who's in the queue, where is it? And so it doesn't mean that the folks that got in line are all going to build the project, but you can at least see maybe what's being dreamed up or what the utilities are thinking about, what might be coming for your community. So it's very eye-opening there. And I think we're ready for questions. Feel free to reach out to Madeline or I in the future. And we've
Thank you
got
for that.
over 15 minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, ladies. This was wonderful. I have a couple of questions. One of them was on large-scale solar development. Do they need to be on contiguous parcels? So the 250 to 500 acres, are they all together?
They're not often for the really large projects. They're often not. I actually had pulled up a map really quickly that Mary had linked in her resources page. This is a map that shows you all of the solar projects we have in Michigan right now. So all these yellow dots are like the rows of panels. And so this here is in Shiawassee County. It's the Assembly Solar Project. And you can really see, you don't have property lines in this one, but you can see that there's definitely gaps in between. And in these cases, you would have wiring kind of going from area to area to connect it all. And I believe the substation where all of the wiring kind of comes together is here. You see that on the satellite image. And then it kind of goes into the transmission grid and gets transported away from there. So this is just providing a little bit of a visual on that. So very often the developer is kind of shopping around, knocks on doors to landowners to see who's interested in being a participating landowner, but certainly not all of them in the area are.
Thank you very much. And earlier in the chat, someone had posted about the MPSC webpage for applications, and it looks like that there's only been one project has applied. Do you know if Ranger Power has been one of the main companies coming into Michigan?
Yeah, Ranger Power actually, they are certainly a main developer here. They have developed this Assembly Solar Shiawassee County project that I just showed you on the map. So it's like currently the largest project. But and Ranger Power has been kind of involved in as the creation of PA 233 came about, and they're kind of involved in policy as well. But there's lots of other developers in this space too. Invenergy has a big project in Calhoun County that is like the second largest at the moment. There are other developers who are building larger projects and smaller projects. So it's a really wide landscape of developers that are active in this space. And I do also expect there to be more applications coming to the MPSC soon. I know that there's a lot of developers who are working with local governments through workable zoning ordinances, but there are cases that are kind of bubbling up in the news where developers have hosted public meetings kind of in preparation for taking projects to the state. So we'll see more. I always keep an eye on that link.
Thank you. With respect to decommissioning, I find this pushback on solar is hypocritical. I've taken the position that, yes, most of us care about such things in your communities, but if this issue concerned you, why not deal with it as a blight ordinance, not just picking on clean energy? Wonder what you think about this approach.
Well, it's novel. It's a novel approach. And it is true. It's kind of this singular technology that we require these decommissioning plans for. I think wind energy also, has decommissioning plans, but we don't do it for a house or a building or that kind of thing. But I think that to kind of address the public concern, these are a unique technology. Oftentimes the landowners wants guarantees as well that can be negotiated in a lease agreement. But if the community wants these concerns, I think it's a reasonable expectation that there's some policy in place to address those concerns. Because it is a really significant, it's a significant cleanup job. So it would far exceed what you might see for a typical blight type of enforcement mechanism.
Thank you. And we also have a session, I just have to point out my plug for the Planning Michigan Annual Conference, which is coming up October 22nd through the 24th in Kalamazoo. And Rex Lamore is going to talk about the host community agreements and decommissioning policies. Thank you. So thank you for that question. Also, while we wait for any more questions, I did want to point out that I just wanted to know, we were able to go on, I've been able to go on one of our workshops, mobile workshops, and one of the items you talked about, Mary, was the landscaping plans and screening, but we saw a site where they didn't have any maintenance plan for the landscaping. So I'm sure it's addressed in the booklet, but one thing you do want to make sure is you have a plan, but it needs to make sure that it's maintained so the trees that are planted don't die. So, okay. Then there's another question here from Mark. Where Consumers Energy is the actual developer, not one of their affiliates, they are claiming that their regulated status exempts them from certain regulations. What do you think about that?
Well, there's probably a lot of specificity to that, Mark, of what's going on. But I do know, for example, where you have where the consumers or DTE, for example, is the developer and they are the owner, they might be exempted from certain permitting requirements, like a building permit, electrical permits. I ran into that up in Mason County, so I'm not sure if that's maybe what you're familiar with, but this might be one of those times where you call, oh yes, in part, he says, yeah. So I would just research the statute if I were you. I think there's validity to what they're saying, but you might need to research that additionally to just verify.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think I immediately thought of building an electrical permits, which I think is a little bit of a can of worms altogether. But I know that in, I believe in the MPSC process, there's a differentiation between utilities and third-party developers when it comes to application fees to the MPSC. I know for battery energy storage, there are some exceptions in the respective fire code for battery storage that exempts utilities from certain documentation compared to third-party private developers. So it's a kind of a thread. I don't know off the top of my head right now all of the areas where there are special rules for utilities. But that's a really good question, Mark.
Thank you.
I had a really just
Mhm.
basic question. What's the difference between a gray field and a brown field?
Well,
I
I
saw
think
that on a slide that there was a gray.
yeah. I think of gray fields as abandoned, maybe more in urban or suburban parking lots, factories, strip malls, just kind of large built areas, but they're not contaminated like a brownfield.
Got
But
it.
they're no longer useful in their current
Right.
state.
Okay, I've never heard that term. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes. A lot of you are still here. Well,
Well, Madeline, do you want to talk about what you can offer or what I can partner with?
Yes, a little advertisement input. So Mary has talked kind of through some of the slides. We have resources on our webpage, which are honestly sometimes a little difficult to find, but really the work we do focuses on helping local governments and their planners. And so we can, through EGLE funding, come out to your community and cover Solar 101 or basics of battery storage or basics of PU 233, helping communities kind of think through the different pathways, the pros and cons of each, how to go about them. We actually, in the past several months, we've kind of toured the state together with folks at EGLE and provided very in-depth workshops for local officials on those pathways and in really understanding P233 and acknowledging things that we still kind of have questions about. But in that process, we developed a card game, which I want to plug a little bit too, which is basically providing kind of the table in card game format where we explain green is the Creo sound standard, blue is the MPSC sound standard, red or yellow is maybe a workable or is a range of workable values. And so we have that for like 10 common zoning items and help communities kind of first build their dream ordinance and then have different prompts of challenging them to, okay, what are your key priorities or what is the concern that you're addressing here? Is it Vista? What is it that you are trying to protect and how can you best address that through zoning? Because sometimes, if it's a visual impact, you can address that through a setback, you can address that through screening. And so kind of playing this game is something that we're happy to send you a card deck of free, or we come to your community and play it through with you. So those are some of the things that we can do. EGLE also allows us to review zoning ordinance drafts and provide a little bit of feedback on, is this an unintended consequence here? Or this is how that section compares to the law. This is how it compares to maybe workable data. So providing a little bit of feedback and just helping you think through as you are thinking about renewable energy, solar and the others as well. We can kind of be of individual support. While I was rambling, another question came in. Repowering got me thinking, should you get a hard number on the length of time or limit it to lease length and request special use permit if repowering? That's a great question. So in the guide, we kind of specify what constitutes a repair versus a repowering. And the core idea is if it expands a footprint, then this would require a new special use permit. So the guide provides language on when do you trigger or when do you require a new permit? lots of the leases are for 30, sometimes 35 years. And so at that point, the landowner has the opportunity to say, I'm not gonna re-sign this, please decommission. Or they renew the lease, or the developer is the landowner themselves. And so I've not thought about kind of putting a time limit on repowering, but rather spelling out criteria, for example, increase of footprint or change of design of rear panels are, or increasing capacity of a project. But from a planner perspective, I would argue, I think the core thing, what I would think about is the footprint. And whatever the developer is producing from a capacity perspective is secondary, maybe. So the guide does provide some language for that. Mary, did I forget something?
I would just say to be careful, as you enter into that water of trying to restrict the time, because you just want to work closely with an attorney on that, because we don't often do that for any other type of zoning permit. You can only have this house for 35 years, right? And so be very careful, I guess. It's my advice.
Okay. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I know I did. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the content that has been discussed, the slides, and then the links, and as well as a survey, brief survey. And we would love to hear what you thought. Have a good afternoon, and we'll hope to see you soon.